Thank you very much, Katina, and I have just pressed the record button. So, Jane, following on from that introduction about all things technical and exciting Spring to Equalities webinars to come and festival to finish it off, would you like to start by introducing yourself? It's a small and select group, so I think we've got enough time for a little round of introductions. And Jed, please do type your intro in a chat and I'll read for everyone.
Thanks, Yaya. That's great. So welcome everybody. I'm Jane Watts. I'm a senior associate at the Learning and Work Institute, and I'm also working freelance in other capacities as well. I specialise on learning and ageing, but I do other equalities related work and community learning work. So I'm interested to hear from all of you, and perhaps if you would introduce yourself, but also ask anything that you particularly want to find out from today's session while you do that. Now, I know you put that on a spreadsheet before when you were signing up for this, but in the meantime, I know what happens. I certainly changed my mind about my key questions, and just ignore my phone that's ringing. My partner will get that somewhere else in the building. So if you just want to go around, I don't know, Sandra, do you want to start since we've already actually said hello?
Let's unmute Sandra's microphone. Sandra, go ahead again, because we...
All right, right, okay. So I'm Sandra Rennie, and I'm based up in Shipley, and I work as a consultant in education and also as a teacher educator. The courses that I run are the level 3, level 4 and level 4 teacher training courses that replace the old Petals and Kettles courses. So that's me. I've had a long time interest in equality. And written a bit about it and done research.
Great, thank you very much. We do have introduction from Jed. Thank you very much, Jed, a student teacher here, particularly interested in all the learners, especially as he is one. Thank you for that intro, and please do feel free to add, comment and questions in the chat, and I'll be minding those and bring them to the attention of everyone. My name is Yaya Sterland. I am working currently as a Learning and Work Institute associate, supporting Katina Barrett, who did the introduction to the session, with organising this series of webinars, and also the Festival of Identities on 10th and 11th of May. I do, in my spare time, also do other consultancy work. At the moment, some interesting work around refugees and ESOL that Jane is also involved in, and I am an associate lecturer at the Derby University. So hopefully you'll come to some of the other webinars, and we'll keep in touch in whatever way following on from today. Over to you, Jane.
Okay, thanks, Yaya. And this event is partly based on the work of the National Older Learners Group, which I coordinate, and with my colleague, who's another Learning and Work associate, Stephen McNair. Between us, we run that group on that institute's behalf. And that brings together quite a lot of the main national agencies and organisations with an interest in older people's learning, and works together with the government departments that are interested, particularly BIS and the Department for Work and Pensions, meets together 3 times a year to try to discuss issues where we can have an influence on policy around the inclusion of older people in learning. The main aims is to share information on policy and practice, to look at learning in the 3rd and 4th ages, and we'll come on to what that might be, and to raise the profile around older learners. try to build partnerships, which works quite well, and to try and make recommendations. So just to set a little bit of the context of where the work came from, and quite a lot of what we might talk about today actually features in a report done by that group last year called A Better Future for Us All. And obviously the link to that will be provided during the course of the session, but also we can circulate that later too. So just to take us further, I'd like you to enter into discussion now, and perhaps just think for yourselves first of all, and then share through the chat, or share in turn through by unmuting your mic, to discuss what do you mean by older? When are you older? What does the word retirement mean to you? And just then a bit about your own context. Are you actually in the business at the moment of providing any learning for older learners, for older people? So obviously looking first of all, what do we think older might mean? And it might be, just given the makeup of the group today, it might just be easier if you put some of those things into the chat. Because it's just a bit easier to get them all up as they come. And then we can, perhaps Yaya can support us by making sure that we can we'll have all those read out.
Thank you. Right, colleagues, shall I start sharing? Jed, thank you very much for your contribution. Again, older, in inverted commas, is the point at which psychological changes to the brain due to the aging process have a direct impact on learning. Of course, that begs the question of age versus expectation versus other factors. Retirement's when you get your pension, and there's a smiley face following on from that. Thank you, Jed. I've contributed some of my own thinking. There is the first thing that came to mind, and that is that it is defined by the context, including culture. Now, culture is awfully wide, and we could talk about it in no end of webinars. But depending on your context, where you are, etc., or where you're from, it could mean different things to different people. Now, Sandra, your message has come to me. I'm sure you meant to share this with everyone. So would you like to read what you've written there?
Yeah, I just realised I typed it privately. Yeah, I meet potential students who are... I meet potential students who ask me if they're too old to do a course because they're in their 50s. This happens quite a lot, actually, and it shocks me. They also often assume they're older than me, and they see themselves as old. And I'm 60, right? And I one of the things I regularly do is I say, I'm considerably older than you, and this, and I don't see that I'm too old to be a student.
Thank you very much for that. Jane, unmute.
Yeah, I'm good. That's really helpful contributions there, folks. And actually, Sandra, that's so typical of what people say, and that's the kind of thing that is why really we need to even be discussing this topic, because you'd think, oh well, that's, you know, with this is just obvious stuff. You know, we're all familiar with the fact that you can't discriminate against people on age, and we know all kinds of other things, but we've just got such a long way to go to explore some of those things about what people think about learning in relation to their aging selves. And then Jed's comments about actually changing physiologically are obviously true, but of course they happen in different ways and at different times. And so that cultural context is really, really important. There are old sayings like you're as old as you feel, and that actually can be quite useful when we're reminding ourselves that the whole concept of being old is culturally defined, has its own context, that each one of us is going to relate to that based on our prior experience, and that also that whole issue about being older, whatever we then mean by that, is intersected by all the other things which might contribute to your own multiple identities. And your students will come along with all that when we're talking about older learners and potential students. And that point, Sandra, about people kind of ruling themselves out is something that we need to address. I mean, at first glance, when we're looking at learning and ageing, we obviously have to start thinking about some issues going on. The whole concept of retirement, of course, has been put into complete flux by changes to the rules, which is there is no longer an official retirement age. There is a state pension age, which obviously if you qualify for a state pension is something that nowadays people mean to mean retired. But in common language, we often talk now about retirement as just meaning when you stop paid work. And there's still a bit of a sense that one day you're going to work and you're working full time, and the next day you just stop. And that cliff edge of retirement is what a lot of people experience still, but is increasingly less the case. Firstly, for reasons of income, because many people need to carry on earning money, even if they're in receipt of some pensions. And for other people, they're not yet eligible to get any pensions at all. And some people don't have a pension. So there's poverty is a huge driver there of what that all means. And obviously all of those things affect how we might think about that. So of course, as with anything in this equalities arena, there's a whole bunch of myths are around, and that includes things like, oh well, older people don't want to learn, you can't learn still when you're older, and I think we can probably all find examples to debunk those. People also make assumptions, and then there are a whole set, I think, of dilemmas that we are faced with, not least of which in this whole field is something about the role of intergenerational work and how we can help to perhaps get rid of some of the myths by trying to work together and in an inclusive way across the generations. Every word I say is in the literature is just completely awash with discussion, debate, disagreement, and so on, you know, even the term generation. But one of the things you'll be aware of from the media is really a lot about this kind of manufactured tension between younger people and older people that some people seem to want to exploit by saying, oh, the baby boomers, that's you and me, Sandra, at least, if not anybody else, have run off with all the money. I'd like to see some of it if I have, but anyway, and then that young people are somehow disadvantaged in that. But that similarly, that can work the other way around as well. We get, because at the moment, for example, younger people are very privileged in terms of education policy, for example, and employability policy, that you can say, oh, well, but nobody's paying any attention to older people's employment. And so, and there is an absolutely correct worry about younger people. But I just would propose that there's a real, it's a real kind of constructed tension that's brought this debate to the fore. It's actually based on something pretty spurious, and that the best thing we can do as educators is to help people find out that actually the generations have far more in common than they don't, and that by working well together, that's how we bring about less discrimination on either side of that. And it has been quite interesting that the way that some politicians have been very keen on jumping on that particular bandwagon. So that was that's just some starting points in thinking about this. But let's have a look at what's going on. So there's been loads in the media, etc., about this.
Jane, just before you move on, it might be a right moment to say now that Jed and Sandra have contributed also their thinking of what you've just
brilliant, yeah.
And Sandra personally fed up with age-segregated leisure activities and courses, and interested in developing intergenerational learning opportunities. And Jed also divide and conquer.
Too right, Jed. Yeah, I know what you mean, Sandra. It's very we do get this kind of everybody trying to be put into little boxes, and there's been quite a bit of research now, I think, to show, particularly for older learners, that they don't want to be segregated, that they'd actually, on the whole, there, as with anything, there's sometimes when you'd quite like to be with somebody who shares something in common with you, but not necessarily age-based. But some of the realities that the policy has got to focus on is that there are less younger people and more older people, and that's a trend that will continue for quite some while. Not as long in the UK as perhaps in some other places, but we are talking decades before the current slight rise in the birth rate results in a slightly higher number of younger people. But even so, for the forthcoming decades, and I mean quite a long time, there will be more older people, and there will continue to be more older people in the country. So at the moment, 1 person in 3 is over 50, and that number will rise. And by 2022, the people in the workforce age between 50 and the state pension age, which by then will be 68 if they haven't chosen to put it up by then, will have risen to 13.8 million. When Learning and Work, well, what was then NIACE, did an inquiry into the future of lifelong learning. They proposed to look at older people within learning and work, and indeed within work, at 50 to 75, which sort of fits with what's happening at the moment. Most people have stopped doing any paid work by 75, although not stopped doing unpaid work. And then learning in later life in the 4th quartile of 75 to 100, and that would give us 3rd and 4th age definitions. So, you know, what does older age mean, if anything, in all these contexts? So if you want to just have any further reflections, add to the chat or contribute in person, just contemplate. I've got some pictures as we go through. So here we are. Here's somebody staying in work as they age. And that's great if you can. And I apologise for not being able to get rid of these edit comments on these slides in this format. And when I share the screen, I can't get rid of some of them. So if you want to just reflect on what I've said so far, any further contributions? Anything from you, Jed? Okay, I'll move on then.
Yeah, I want to say that she doesn't look at an older worker, and I'm looking at her thinking, am I supposed to be looking at her thinking, oh, this is an older person working? And I'm thinking, like, she looks younger than most of the people I meet if I visit people in hospitals. So, I mean, working in hospital.
Jed's guessing that she might be about 50-ish.
All right. Well, I'm no good at guessing these things. So.
Well, I'm not sure we know, but we do know that the source of the picture was in the older learners category of Adult Learners Week, which would mean that that she's over 50.
That we choose a picture of somebody who's sort of, you know, reasonably presentable, young-looking person.
Yeah. Well, the reason for that is when we come to look at learning to stay and work, we know that in the workplace, age discrimination starts to kick in at about the age of 50. And that stat has been holding up really well, you know, despite changes in other things around expectations of older people. So despite the fact that there is this huge push by government for people to stay and work, then for as long as possible, and a couple of reasons for that. One is because of rising state pension age, but also because of the likely falling tax take if we don't. You know, that's a huge driver for government on this one. Then actually, if discrimination by employers kicks in around the age of 50, there's a very, very slight bit of evidence at the moment. It might be creeping up, but it hasn't got beyond 51 or 52. So we're still talking as quite a disadvantage in the workplace, but at the same time, a real push around employability to do that. Now, yeah, did I see another chat just come in there?
Just as you were going to pause, I was going to share with everyone Jed's comment, and that is that following on from commenting on a picture and saying that she's about 50, and what you've said, and Sandra, that is part of the issue, isn't it? Physically, age can mean such a wide range of health and capabilities. And then tell me about it. Was when you looked at, you know, I think it was the last line was in relation to the Ros Altman's 3 R's and the fact that we all have to work longer.
Yes. So here we are working longer. And Ros Altman, when she was the champion, the older workers champion, of course, she's become pensions minister now and can't possibly say anything of the sort. But her mantra was retain, retrain and recruit. That was targeted at employers to try and get over this kind of discriminatory behaviour. So the easiest way to maintain your older workforce is retain. You can, of course, if people's skills are becoming out of date, retrain. And then you can also make a great effort and recruit older people. And I had an interesting comment from Fiona Aldridge at Learning and Work on that very topic this week, because she's been doing a lot of work around localism and working with employers in some of the local areas which will get devolved budgets. And employers are now, whereas in the past they weren't apparently terribly aware of the demographic change, although goodness knows how they've missed it, given it's in loads of media, they are now very aware of it, and that their response so far, and this was said with just a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless with some seriousness as well, was that they, however, are very confident that their business will be able to continue to recruit the bright young things, and that it's the other employer down the road who will end up having to make a great effort to retain, retrain and recruit their older workforce. So, which she also found worrying but amusing at the same time. So it's to sort of push it off to other people, and it'll all be fine. So on that note, one of the things that NIACE, when it was still NIACE, did was to do some pilot projects on midlife career review. These have now been implemented across the National Careers Service and particularly by Union Learn through their Union Learning reps. But there will be further projects and a new website coming shortly which encourages people and the guidance services to be able to offer something much better by way of the opportunity to review in mid-career, which is probably around the age of 50, but will strike other people at different moments really as to when it's appropriate for them to have a rethink, to retrain, to think about perhaps, you know, if you're in midlife and you've got another 20 years of your working life in front of you, do you want to carry on doing the same thing that you've been doing already? Or do you want this opportunity to perhaps have another think? So I'm just going to check out those chats and then bring in some discussion. So let's move on to another person who retrained. And oh yes, I've got them again now. So that's good. So we've got more contributions. Sandra, do you want to talk us through your one there?
At age 50, the college I was working at, Bradford College, did a massive redundancy, and the reason why they had to do it was because of the ageing workforce. If you look at adult education, FE in general, there was a great big lump of people. So there was, and basically they were keen to get rid of the older age workers, because that was most of their workers, and replace them with younger workers. Not that they would have said that at the time. But I was shocked to actually realise that I was an elder worker, because it hadn't occurred to me at age 50. And the second comment I made was actually about when you were talking about the workplace down the road that's always saying, well, we're not going to have to be able to adapt. You know, we're going to have to, you know, we'll have the right young things and they'll have to deal with the old, you know, the dross. It's actually, we ought to reclaim this narrative and not allow these stereotypes to influence the way we talk. I mean, because this is an issue of how the workplace needs to be flexible and adapt to the changing economic market and the changing needs of the workers. It's not really, I mean, it's kind of almost like we're carrying on the stereotyping that one assumes that the bright young things are going to be better than the people down the road who are you know, the older ones. I know that wasn't the intention, but I just feel it's more of an issue about how we structure work opportunities and learning opportunities, rather than about how we label people.
Absolutely. We'll move on. So this would be our own tactics for if we're trying to find ways of staying in work, you know, and carrying on. So you can try and stay in your current job, but then if you get offered a redundancy or a forced redundancy, which happens to a lot of people, particularly as we've had economic downturns, and a bit of a sense that we've got a bit of one emerging again now, then that becomes increasingly difficult. And then I think, you know, as you've just described, we can look at different ways of using our current skills, or perhaps being a bit more flexible in the workplace. And again, Sandra, that relates to, you know, that new workplace flexibility that doesn't quite seem to be coming to the fore as much as we would like it to, actually. And that's just acknowledging that there are a lot of other pressures on people, perhaps from midlife onwards. We've heard quite a lot of discussion about people in midlife having to perhaps still care for older children, or at least still support older children in some way, to perhaps care for peers, partners, and older relatives who needing extra support. And also having a set of other pressures, and then another set of things that you perhaps want to do with your time, not just spend so much time going to work anymore if you can afford to change that. The really harder option is to find a new job using new skills that you've learned. Retraining and then finding a job out of that is a pretty difficult route, not least of which because the availability of free training is almost nil for post-25 people. And then the one that a lot of people like the idea of, but it's very hard to do in practice, is to turn leisure activities into paid work, either through setting up businesses or social enterprises of some kind. So there's a range of options, but that's only looking at the midlife, and we're going to have to carry on working for quite a while to come yet. I think this one might be identified as a somewhat older worker than the previous picture, but this is the point where you're somewhere between the two, where you might have to keep retraining and doing something completely different in your later life, or indeed turning hobbies into job activities or means of earning income. So as you move through the life course, another kind of learning that comes in is about learning to prepare for later life. very quickly mention that pre-retirement learning has an availability, but for very few people, increasingly, in fact, for very few people. So people in senior positions usually get some, but it's usually very much too late, i.e. about within the last 6 months of their paid employment. And really covers generally what they're going to do with their vast pension investments. Of course, for the rest of everyone, then this is a rather different issue. So only really the public sector has a wider offer other than for senior people. And there are some voluntary organisations and indeed some new projects who are doing pre-retirement learning and trying to move it forward. And then some enlightened employers. And I would mention as a particular example, Age UK, who currently are running a new scheme for all their employees, and they include every sort of staff at every level and every income group within the organisation, and at whatever age they feel it's appropriate, to take part in their new extended working life programme, which combines midlife reviews, which are done peer-to-peer, and then referred out for professional help if they want career service type intervention. And they also have a pre-retirement learning, but that's offered in a holistic way, not just focusing on pensions, and done within at least the last 2 years, if not longer, before you think you might be wanting to retire. So it gives you a bit more scope for planning. And some of the pensions workshops that they do within that are available throughout your time at Age UK, because obviously you can't start planning for the future within a couple of years of retiring, because that doesn't give you any time to do any saving, assuming that you can at all. So that's a different take on later life learning from the ones we were discussing earlier. So if anybody wants to add anything here, I've got there's another little picture while we just share any discussion points or anything that people want to add on the chat. I know there's one more chat since I last looked. So Jed has contributed. Yeah, do you want to just share that one with everyone?
Sure. It is about a debate on LinkedIn about a year back about the problem of all the software developers, and the age that was considered to define all the software developers was 25 plus. Now, it would have been interesting, Jane, if you had a picture of one such developer in this discussion. And also that, again, personal experience from Jed about an interviewer stopped the interview, look at him and a horror and amusement and ask, how old are you? It's a little bit explicit.
And now Jed's apologising because he thinks he's oversharing, but really, Jed, no, I think that's exactly what we need. We need to hear those personal experiences, because let's face it, it happens, doesn't it? You know, we've been there, we've heard the tales, and we've heard other people's tales. So, you know, let's give ourselves a think. So what do we think? Is this person paid or unpaid in this work?
Well, I think she's unpaid.
Well,
Looks like she's working in a community radio station, and most people working in community radio stations are unpaid. It's not about her age, it's to do with her job. But
yeah.
Is it a radio station or is it a switchboard of some sort? No, it's a radio station, isn't it?
It is. Yes, it is a voluntary role, but of course it could be something that one was paid to do, but this is a voluntary role. It's actually a hospital radio station, but community radio station, hospital, that, you know, they operate in the same way. So the work I referred to earlier on, the work of the National Older Learners Group, one of the things we did last year was to just describe from our various pieces of previous research the declared benefits of learning in older age. And at this point, I think we're really talking about not just the 50 plus, but more the 65 plus probably as well. in particular, or if we're using the quartiles again, just a little bit older than that too. And there are some obvious ones that won't be particularly new to anybody, but one of the things that out of a piece of work that we did, which was looking at participation rates in later life, which are typically much lower than at younger ages in learning. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, not least of which how much harder it is to get anything free at that stage in the life course. That one of the main motivators for older people to learn was around being able to share their skills and their knowledge. And I think WEA currently have a project called Older and Wiser, which is about thinking about how you would share skills. They're also unpacking the myth of whether you do actually get wiser as you get older, of course, but there's always a question. But anyway, so some of the benefits that we came up with were things like being able to contribute and engage better, manage things, manage the life transitions better, because those do really take people by surprise, and we're ill prepared often for those. And that's why I was talking about pre-retirement learning earlier. Enabling people to use digital technology, but also increasingly technologies that support people themselves, for example, to live more independently in their own homes. And there's a lot of research going on around those kinds of technologies at the moment. To contribute to people being better carers and recipients of care. And again, that gives us great opportunities. We were talking earlier about intergenerational work, great opportunities to work together across the generations there to try and dispel myths and so on. Learning has been shown to benefit as well across health and well-being, to improve your own financial security, to maintain independence, and just keeping going and keeping that sense of that you're continuing to develop as a human being, and it doesn't matter what age you are, that should be the case. Then we've talked so far about learning in midlife, learning in later age, learning later in life, and then learning in the fourth age, which is the 75 plus group I mentioned earlier. And some of the things there, that there are a range of reasons for continuing to learn. People like to, stay stimulated if they can. And some of the really great research in the past has been done around learning in care settings, which can include people living in their own home, but with receipt of a lot of care packages. And some of the findings from that kind of work really stress the wider benefits of continuing to learn. They provide huge roles for mentors from all ages, and again a nice challenge to the kind of age stereotyping, like we were talking about before, that people think quite often about this sort of setting of having young mentors or young tutors or young people coming in to support the learning of the older people, but actually a well-run scheme would have learning shared across those generations in those settings, so that you don't just assume that this is a passive older person taking part in the learning and an active younger person, but it could be that it's also the other way around. So an organisation called Learning for the Fourth Age is particularly strong, and that are a social enterprise, and they struggle for funding, but nevertheless do some great work. A few years ago, NIACE did a nice piece of research which is still available, and I'll include the reference to that later on. For people in doubt of post-75 positive learning, one of the community learning fund projects that we supported a few years ago, funded by BIS, was this Royal Academy of Dance project, where they trained teachers of dance to work with people over 75, which was a total challenge to their whole culture, and was great fun for them. But this project report, which is still available on the Royal Academy of Dance website, was a particularly positive thinking. So perhaps now is the moment for a little bit more reflection and any comments from people in the group. And I noticed there's a couple more.
Would you like to read them, Jane, or would you like either Katina or I to do so?
Katina, can you speak to your own there, please?
I think it was just as you were talking and with Jed's comments, and it was just this thing about as I get older, I realise that I, you know, as we all do, that we're turning into our parents, and part of that is the tendency to say, to think, to feel still, oh, I'll just run across the road, oh, I'll just jump up and do whatever, oh, I'll just dash too. And it is that there is something very protective and hardwired in us to expect to continue to be able to do things, you know, cognitively and neurologically. So the social construct of preparing for something different and that's more uncertain, and that you don't get to spontaneously respond, I find quite difficult, because it obviously about serving the purpose of the particular kind of structures that we have, rather than perhaps the kind of things that are much more innate. Now, I'm not saying that continues all the way through. I think there is a later stage in which perhaps we do arrive at a place where our brains have learned that. But, you know, they've had to have many years, 60 years, to think that's complex. And then suddenly we want to change the whole of that. And that's partly because of a social construct. And I think that's the very real difficulty, is that not only the resistance to preparing, or the not being prepared, is actually counter all of the instinctive things that are going on in your brain and your body around the rest of everything else that you do. I can't be old when the rest of me is not yet there, and yet society is asking me to do that.
Yeah, and Sandra, do you want to come in on yours?
Well, it's kind of, I think if you think learning is actually a way of life, and actually learn, because that's actually what we do from the moment we're born throughout our life. Learning is a fundamental indicator of being alive, you know, and being human, or even an animal, but actually being alive. And if we see that that's an important to be fully alive, then actually all this stuff that we're looking at, all the entire, you know, PowerPoint to some extent, because it's focusing on the instrumental nature of learning and how learning must lead to economic activity, and even if it leads to health and well-being, that's because it saves us money, right? It's kind of, I have the feeling that somebody else has taken over the narrative of this story, and it's not my story anymore, it's somebody else's story.
I'm really pleased that people have picked up on those issues, because that's exactly the drivers, of course, for the policy, is about the economics of it. But what I'm delighted to see recently are some thoughts amongst some of the commentators, not just around learning and ageing, but just on ageing generally, about how the notion of active ageing and positive ageing can be really very negative as well. Because if you're not in that position and you don't want to buy into this economic construct and stay and work forever and do all kinds of other wonderful and positive things that keep being lauded, then there's a real question mark about, well, so some of the writers on this have, and particularly Daniel Klein, an American journalist, has done a small book, which is quite interesting, where he just goes, this positive aging lark, it's an absolute nonsense, you know, that we're being forced into all this positivity. I just want to grow old gracefully in my own way, whatever I mean by that, and I'm not going to have a facelift. And I think this is very much from the American context, but he's just saying he's surrounded by people who feel that they are being forced to pretend they're young, when actually it would be quite nice to just admit you're old and get on with it. And whatever old is and whatever old means, just do that and be proud about being old. And I do think that's really helpful in response to those comments.
But even admit, it sounds like you've done something wrong by being old. If you're saying, admit you're old, actually, I'm just going to state that I'm old, right?
Yes,
and be quite
absolutely
relaxed about it, not proud, but not admitting either. That's just me. Take me as I am. don't try and get me to be an economic unit if that's it. You know, I'd much rather be a human being.
And funnily enough, I think that's one of the differences. If I think about things like the Identities Festival, I think that's one of the differences around how we treat the protected ground around age compared to the other ones, actually. I think that the whole kind of sense of all of the other protected grounds is about, it's constantly about kind of either about equalising things or it's about recognising the multifacetedness, but somehow age sits out of that. And I think it's also because, for example, if we just took the Skills Funding Agency and the way that it monitors the protected grounds, it doesn't monitor age in the way it monitors the other protected grounds. It collects age for a completely different reason and in a completely different place. Do you know what I mean? So the way in which we treat that is very, very different. And I think that there have been some salutary lessons for us, funnily enough, about age, and it's meaningless in lots of ways, with the, you know, the kind of slight obsession at the moment with celebrity deaths in this year, and the analysis that's been going on. But if you look at huge age extremes there, the issue is that actually almost all of them were people who were still leading very active lives, whether they were in their 90s or whether they're the guy who's in, you know, it was the thing the other day, there's a politician in the States who's 90-odd and he's just about to marry for the second time. His first marriage was to a woman, his second marriage is to a man, and he just talks about that being the continuum of his life. What's really interesting, though, is the two issues that come up there and that make that newsworthy are age, and that comes first, would you believe? That's almost the most scary or unusual thing, and then actually that hits gay marriage comes second. Do you know what I mean? So there's something about where age is juxtaposed in our consciousness that's a kind of real issue there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to, you know, that there needs to be a way to link that to the freedom that we're trying to, or the multifacetedness, fluidity that we're trying to claim for other identities. Because there's the other thing. People used to think identity was, you know, immutable, didn't they? You know, that was like nothing changes. Now we realise that just about every protected ground is fluid and can change. But actually, the one that you can guarantee changes every blooming year is your age, if we buy into, but you know, dates of birth and chronological age. So it is the archetypal fluid protected characteristic, but we never claim it as that. We never think of it in that way. We never see here, you know, you want to look about fluid identity, this is where it starts. And that journey, that sweeping journey that we make through life that's based on age, you know, it's kind of really critical to that debate, but it's not in there.
Yeah. Can we just look at Jed's comment, which where he says, I think the average student doesn't feel able to or entitled to see learning for the sake of learning as something they can do, and they need a utility in order to be able to sell it to themselves, and that picks up on that sort of economic point, but and obviously given the expense of it, but yes, it's a utility that they need, but actually they're being encouraged into that because we as a learning sector are being encouraged to see it in utilitarian terms and not in learning for learning's sake terms. And I love your comment, Jed, on the fetishization of youth and keep young and beautiful. So I'll break into song, except I probably won't, it's best not. So just perhaps then, just given the time perhaps to move on, some of the things to think about in terms of introducing learning for around ageing are about looking at key transitions. So we've covered them really in the points, which is about the midlife transition, which might only feel that it applies to some people don't experience that, but where they might want to make changes. The notion of a transition in retirement, and that's really when you enter a phase where your income comes from sources other than paid work. And then arriving at the point of much older age. So just another one here. So one of the ways that it helps to look at some of this stuff and explore perhaps some of the ideas that Katina just said there is around using story. And there's some couple of really interesting projects going on at the moment, looking at transitions in the life course in older age through the use of story and looking at whether individual stories can can offer something to, for example, local authorities about how they structure their own thinking and policies around the needs of older people, or becoming an age-friendly city, or one of the many different initiatives that are going on. Personally, don't like that expression, and I'm not quite sure what age-friendly ever means, but I don't really like it, but there we are. There's a huge movement, as you're probably aware, of age-friendly cities, and looking at what that really might mean in practice, and getting people of all ages to experience and think about the life course through stories. So the Age Action Alliance group, called Valuing the Contribution of Older People, has a project which is headed up by the Centre for Policy on Ageing and funded by Gulbenkian to do just this, and is doing pilot projects around story and life course in Southampton, Leeds and East Kent at the moment. And I think that, you know, it's quite, that's something that education and learning has to offer. I think the sorts of issues that that are being explored would just give us a different way of looking at things. It's much more of a community learning approach, the kind of non-formal and informal learning that Sandra, I think you referred to. And I've just seen a question come in there from Sandra about the transitions. They're gradual transitions, and increasingly they are gradual transitions, and particularly what was a very definite transition of a compulsory retirement, which doesn't exist anymore, is increasingly tapered, flexible. People come in and out of the workforce in later life, and so on. And there's and obviously increasing use of part-time working. So we should be moving on. It's never too late to learn, I think we need to be saying. So one of the things that we within the National Older Learners Group are looking at different ways of bringing about strategies for public policy. And this is obviously going to be back to, well, how do we sell this to policymakers to make sure that people can get access to the learning? And inevitably, unfortunately, we can't usually get them to accept the learning for learning's sake arguments. So we will have to look at benefits which are either economic or have wider implications, but which ultimately still come back often to an economic benefit, including, as you mentioned, the health and well-being ones. So we've been thinking a bit about that, but maybe it would be quite useful for you to think now and perhaps contribute around some ideas about what might work well in your own context. I'll come back to that one. So what might work well where you are in terms of making sure we can
Jane, I'm aware that you have not timed us for this thinking, and that
I'm going to interrupt in a minute. Okay, nice idea, Sandra. Do you want to just talk about that?
Well, it seems to me that Well, because I train teachers and they give them an introductory training, it seems to me that what they need to get opportunities to do is to actually get opportunities to practice their teaching in a supported environment with mentors. But also, a lot of people doing teacher training for the first time in adult education have to work as volunteer teachers because they can't get teacher practice in any other way. And it seems to me, if this was organised in a proper structured way, then you could actually achieve providing mentorship support for the people who are being teachers, and actually providing free or cheaper learning opportunities for people locally who probably wouldn't necessarily get involved in learning. This notion that I'm too old to learn, or it's not relevant for me, or it's too hard. So it's actually about making learning accessible by providing some support and mentored and trained support for people new to teaching, and giving them the opportunity to get that work experience, which would help them to get a paid job at a later point as well. So I actually applied for some funding for this. It wasn't successful, but and was considering another approach to it.
There's a lot of noise going on there. Just that's useful. Just to move on, just quickly, I'll tell you that City Lit, the adult college in one of the adult colleges in London, has developed a strategy around older learners, and so they were addressing two challenges, particularly around funding and fees, obviously for older learners, and the 24 plus loans, which are having a huge impact on curriculum decisions, and they weren't happy with the way that was affecting. And they have a quite high percentage, something like 60% of their learners are over 50. So they've done some research into their older learners and made themselves much more aware of their older learners, and they are doing a whole set of next steps now to reshape their curriculum in response to that, and to look at how that they can best take forward a strategy. And that's just one option of the way that learning organisations can move forward. So there's the NOLG, when we were looking at what we would want to do, is establishing learning as a human right for all, including older people, making sure that we've built local partnerships and make the best use of public funding, of the limited public funding that there is. But your own strategies might just increase your understanding of who your older learners are, establish the sorts of choices and what benefits they're getting, and making sure that then your curriculum can be designed with the input of all your learners, but older people, including older people, to make sure that you really do get the best offer that you can. The remaining slides that I've got are just lists of where the both credits of the photos and some key resources and projects that are going on. By no means exhaustive, there are many, many more. So really, if we can just start to wrap up now by getting final comments from everybody, either in the chat or through the mic.
Jane, shall I read what Jed has said earlier? And that is really a question about the effects that the loans are having.
Okay, that's the loans are, well, there's a slight decline in over 50s taking part in learning, but that was already a fairly low number, so it's hard to attribute them directly. Providers anecdotally appear to feel that the low levels of funding for 25 plus learners have a negative effect on the take-up of learning. DWP are doing some pilots at the moment to unemployed older people and looking at the options around that. It'd be quite interesting when their pilots report in later this summer. Later in the autumn probably. And I'm not sure, but I don't think it doesn't look like it's very positive. As you can imagine, people in midlife pretty reluctant generally to take out further loans for anything. especially people who've already got maybe very high outgoings compared to income, or people who have mortgages or who have children who need support at that point, maybe children going through higher education, for example, or going into unfunded other development. So you sort of young people support, and a whole set of other reasons why somebody in their midlife might be reluctant to take out a loan, certainly having an impact. There is some work going on around that to try and understand it better, I think, at the moment. Katina, I don't know if you've got anything more up to date on that?
No, I shake my head and then I say something. We had obviously the Government Office for Science stuff is going apace. So I think we should kind of watch for more of that. They're looking to do something that might make it grown, of course, which is the sort of stuff linked to the BIT and the behavioural insights stuff. So I feel us all being, I don't know, you know, I didn't say coerced, persuaded. You know, to behave like sensible older people.
No, we don't want to be sensible older people.
By somebody's definition, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, I tend to switch at the moment because, you know, as each birthday arrives, I feel I kind of felt that 0 to 5, I was being told how to kind of work in this world, you know, and now I discover you get the same kind of stuff at the other end, but almost with force.
Yeah, I'm determined to resist as much as possible, you know. Just anybody else want to come in?
Again, Jed has contributed earlier at that when learning equals debt, learning ain't so attractive, which is a comment, I think, on the lot that you were, yes. Although I do hear, and I've got no evidence of this at all, that student finance for higher education for people above certain age may be quite attractive if they haven't already used up their entitlement, because they may not end up paying back much.
You're muted, Sandra.
If they don't earn above the threshold, then they might not pay back at all. So that's a possibility for some people in higher education.
Absolutely.
Students do higher education courses with me on that basis, because they know, for various reasons, because of disability or age, that they will get some jobs, but they will never earn above the threshold. I'm not sure how much it is, but it was something about, it was about 15,000, 20,000 something. Can't remember now, but yeah.
Okay, so I think we're just about there. Yaya, do you want to wrap up in any way?
Well, just to say thank you again to Sandra and Jed for joining us, and of course to you for excellent presentation and very engaging discussion. I think it was kind of cozy. Jed did say in a chat that when learning oh yes, I've read that one. Oh, currently 21k, that is in the figure, and how that might work for some people. So Jane's slides and the recording of this webinar, providing that it's of a good enough quality, will be made available as a resource, one of many resources on the Equalities Toolkit website. The Equalities Toolkit website also has a linked Twitter account where Katina daily tweets resources that can be used for teaching, learning and assessment by practitioners anywhere. So if you're not familiar with the resources there, please do check out. The festival that we mentioned at the beginning of the session is also publicized on the website, and this is where you're going to find the information about it, but also how to book tickets and tell us who you are, so that others who are coming know that you're coming and can seek you out at the event and engage with you around issues that you wish to explore. It is going to be hopefully different from what we usually do as events and conferences to discuss equality and diversity, in that Katina's worked really hard to get people who explore these issues in creative and different ways to come along and share this with others. So one example is Kelly Pritchard-Smith of Manchester University doing a part of her stand-up routine where she explores the links between mathematics and identity, and it's one of those sold-out shows from the Pint of Science event. So do come along. If you can't find the information, where I've directed you to the Equalities Toolkit, you've got my contact details through the webinar booking, and I'll be very happy to discuss with you. Or if you experience any issues around booking a place to come to the event, etc., I'm very happy to assist with all of those. And there are a few other webinars that we're doing as part of the series to the run-up to the festival. So do tell others. There might not be something that you're interested in. We'll be talking about carers in a workplace. We'll be talking about autism and equality and diversity in the community learning and family learning. So just some of the titles. So do tell others and do join us if you can. Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you everyone again. And I'm going to stop recording.